Welcome to Creating a Table Part 2. And in Part 1, I went over some very basic foundational information about creating tables to keep from tripping the new guys up that are kind of new to the party here. And now I want to show you a couple of examples of creating tables. And there's a couple of ways to create them here. I can either do it with a graphical user interface tool. It's built into the SQL Server Management Studio. And I can build them with Transact SQL. And you can always get a fight going between administrators and designers on which is the best way to build a table. Just use the one that makes the most sense to you, and you can either graduate from yours to the other kind, whether that's up or down, whichever. So just get comfortable with one of these. Now, the first place to start, go to Help and go to Index. And obviously, if you'll type in Create Table, you're going to go out and start in Books Online, and you will notice that there is quite a bit of information here. Notice the syntax and all the options you have on creating a table. And by the way, while I'm here, notice you can create constraints on the columns, table constraints, just all kinds of things. Index options, you can create indexes and index options and so forth. Lots of things to read here. This will give you something to do instead of sitting in front of the TV, being bored, playing video games, having hobbies, relationships with other people, that sort of thing. Instead of doing all that, you can read this stuff, right? There's always something else to read. And so this is something for you. Go through this and read it. Notice there's lots of linked information here more about tables. So just print that out and go through it. It'll help you tremendously on the T-SQL side. So what I'm going to do first is create a table using Transact SQL. I'm going to create a table called Mark in the Pubs database. So I'll just click on Pubs, click on the new query, and you'll notice I'm in the Pubs database now. So I'll come down, and I want you to notice how simple this is. First of all, I will type Create Table, who would have thought, right? And then I just put the name of the table that I want to create. Now the syntax says that we have to list the column definitions in parentheses, and I'll drop down a line, start my parentheses, and drop down another line. This makes it very readable. I can keep up with what I've done. You'll see why in just a moment. And T-SQL doesn't care about white space, and so I'll use it liberally here. Now, what I'm going to do is just list the column name, the data type for that column, and then any specifics for that column. And the little table that I've been using in the example so far, we'll just continue that. So my first column is going to be called ID. I put a single space, and I put the data type. And if you remember, I used a small integer in the previous example in a different movie. And notice that if I do this with Transact SQL, I need to know my data types. And so that might be a little bit more of a nerdy approach. Now, then I'm going to put a space, and I need to designate whether I will allow nulls in this particular column or not. Now, if I don't mention nulls, it will allow them. So I'm going to say not null, and then I'll put a comma, go to the next line, and do it again. So the next column will be called first for first name. If you remember, I used varchar 25 space, not null. You have to have a first name to work here. Last, it's varchar 25, not null. You have to have a last name to work here. We're kind of picky that way. And then I had the status. Name of the column was status, and I did varchar 8. Now, let me tell you something that's a great pastime for developers and database administrators, and that is to argue about these data types. Why did you use varchar 8? Why didn't you use char 8? Why didn't you use something else? Why didn't you just do it binary? Yes, no, that sort of thing, 0 or 1. Don't worry about that stuff. You'll have plenty of time to think about that, but for now, we'll just go with varchar 8. Just know there's a number of different ways to skin this cat, that being a technical Southern term. A lot of ways to get this done, and I will allow nulls in this column, and I won't put a comma at the end of that one because that will be my last column, but I'll just close my parentheses. And so now all I have to do is click the magic execute button, and I should get, yes, command completed successfully. Now, I'll show you a little weird thing about the Management Studio. If I come over here and expand Pubs and look at tables, I don't see a table called Mark. What's happened here? It says it was successful. I need to right-click and refresh my environment here, and magically, there's Mark. Now, if I expand that and look at my columns, you will notice that I don't allow nulls in the ID, the first, the last, but I allow nulls in the status column. And notice there's my character type, my data types, varchar 825, small integer. Very easy way to create a table called Mark that way. Now, to do it in a graphical user interface environment, this is tough. Just right-click on the little folder tables here and say New Table. Now, if you've ever worked in Access, this is going to look eerily similar to Access. And I'm going to create a table called Mark 2, but notice it hasn't asked me for a table name. This feels a little bit funky at first. So the column name is ID. The data type, now this is kind of cool. I can get a drop down and see all of my options. So I can just choose small integer there. And do I want to allow nulls? No. And next one, remember it was first. And I can start typing and it'll complete it for me. Notice varchar, it defaults to 50. I'll have to change that to 25. And I don't want to allow nulls. Last, you see where I'm headed here. Just to show you, I could come down here and choose varchar. And again, I can double click that, change it to 25, don't allow nulls, and then status. And I did varchar 8. And I will leave that one clicked on allow nulls. Notice there is a name down here, and this is for this particular column. I'm doing column properties. Now, let me just show you a couple of things down here, and I want to pull this up so we have a little bit more room. Notice I can choose collation and so forth, whether this is an identity column, whether it's indexable, whether it's sparse, get into some of that stuff a little bit later. But you can set a lot of properties on these columns down here. But notice when I actually close this, it says, do you want to save changes to the following items? And I say yes, and it says, what's the name of the table? Now that feels real funky to close that out and get that table name. And I will call it Mark 2. That's a very intuitive name for a table, don't you think? But for the purposes of the course, I'm just trying to show you how to create a table. I'm not going to fret over what's going to be stored in the table. Notice this one shows up right down here, and there's Mark 2, and if I expand that, you see my columns and my data types and so forth. So that's the two ways to create tables, either through Transact SQL or the graphical user interface. And we can get a little bit more complex from there, and we'll talk about some other things that happen with tables later on in the course.